My name is Nico van Stralen. I'm a biologist by profession and by training also. And I was a professor of animal ecology for a long time in this university, the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. But I take animal ecology in a very wide sense. So I've done evolutionary biology, evolutionary ecology, molecular ecology, animal physiology, zoology, but of course also toxicology, the science that comes most close to my heart.
I'm Pim de Voogd, and I'm trained as an environmental analytical chemist. I chaired a group at the University of Amsterdam called Aquatic Environmental Ecology, and I also work part-time at KWR Water Cycle Research Institute in Nieuwegein, which is the research institute of the water suppliers in the Netherlands. And my main interest is in the fate of chemicals in the environment. And for instance, at the KWR Institute, we look specifically at the fate of chemicals in water.
When I was at secondary school, that was the end of the 1960s, and this was a time of great societal changes. Bob Dylan wrote a song about it, and we felt like that. We felt like we were in a time of change. We discussed a lot about the quality of the environment. I read the book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. I think it was published 1962, but I read it in 1968 in Dutch translation. And that had a great impact on me. And so it's also interesting in retrospect to think, how we as boys of 17, how naive and idealistic we were. But it was really important. It's also interesting to see how you can be influenced by books. And so that for me was the main reason to go on and study biology. Something must change in this world, I was thinking.
Well, as a master student in chemistry at the University of Utrecht, I got involved in the experimental educational groups called Project Education. And these groups tackled projects or issues, I should say, that were brought forward by citizens or by NGOs. So to give an example, one example was the heavy metal contamination of suburbs near smelters in the city of Utrecht. And perhaps an even more striking example was that we were asked by the Vietnam Committee in the Netherlands to develop a synthesis method for making a disinfectant that could be used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnamese wars. So by being involved in these kind of projects, I got really interested in environmental contamination and protecting the environment. Well, I was doing my MSc study in chemical oceanography at the island of Texel. When being there and living at the island of Texel, I very much came into contact with nice nature and the importance of trying to protect the environment, especially the local environment. At the time of my graduation, heavy metals were very much the focus of environmental chemistry. But soon after that, people in the Netherlands like Jan Koeman and Herman van Genderen discovered that chlorinated pesticides were having effects on the birds, especially eider ducks. And internationally, a person like Søren Jensen discovered that PCBs were actually bioaccumulating in seals and in sea eagles. And perhaps the most important development was again in the Netherlands, where Peter Reinders showed that populations fed with fish from the Wadden Sea were reproducing much less than populations of seals fed with fish from the North Sea. So that was really an important event that triggered my interest.
I was a PhD student and I graduated, and then I got involved into environmental toxicology from an ecological background. So being an ecologist, I suddenly discovered that environmental chemists and toxicologists had already been collaborating on the issue of environmental science. Then there was a very big symposium in 1984, organized in Amsterdam, which attracted a lot of attention. And to me, that was a kind of eye-opener. The beginning of a new science, eco-toxicology, so the collaboration between chemists, toxicologists, and ecologists. I gave a presentation there, and after that time, I became fully aware that this field needed further development. I remember very well that somebody, a student of ours actually, called me, and he worked for the city of Amsterdam, and he called me by telephone. He said, well, Nico, I have here this dredge material from the harbor of Amsterdam. And I note there is several thousands of milligrams per kilogram polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in these dredge materials. What should we do about it? I said, I don't know. And nobody knew at that time. There were no standards, there were no evaluation methods, no assessment methods. And so that you clearly see that was a very important trigger for the development of test methods, evaluation methods, and everything. So the beginning of environmental toxicology. The international context of environmental toxicology has been shaped very much by CTEC, Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. This is a society that tries to unite the different disciplines that all participate and contribute to environmental toxicology, so the toxicologists and the chemists and the ecologists. And it also, very importantly, tries to unite the different stakeholder groups from the whole field. So let's say the scientists, the regulators, the governmental organizations, and also the chemical industry.
It's also very important because it brings together people from all over the world. Nowadays we have branches even in South America, in Australia, in the Southeast Asia, Pacific, and Africa. So this really shows that we have an international society, and actually the numbers also show how important this society has become. We started in Europe with the first annual meeting with 300 people, and nowadays we have 2,500 people convening in the next meeting in Helsinki.
It is, I think, indicative of the growing awareness in all these countries that environmental pollution is a serious issue, that it should be addressed, and that it needs also a scientific basis, a scientific underpinning. And that's what we try to do. There are new developments and new shifts all the time. But to me, in the beginning, a very important development was developing the education in environmental toxicology, because I've very much felt we needed new and young scientists to be educated. There were already some textbooks. I believe the book by Moriarty was published 1982, and there was a French textbook published 1979 already. And there have been several new textbooks after that. At the same time, the field diversified very much, and so there is also a need for teaching materials that cover a wider and wider field.
I think a very important development was the fact that because of the work of people like Jan Koelman and Peter Reinders, students and staff from all over the world wanted to come to the Netherlands. So for instance, Professor Roland Vrij and Professor Otto Hutzinger came to the Netherlands to chair groups at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and at the University of Amsterdam. And they became world-class groups in analytical chemistry and environmental chemistry and toxicology. For instance, the dioxin cases were actually more or less discovered by them together with, of course, fellow scientists elsewhere in the world. Another development, I think, that is very important is the notion that instead of using total concentrations of chemicals, for instance, of a heavy metal in water, that you had to look more specifically at the concentration of that chemical that was really available for uptake by organisms, the so-called bioavailable fraction. And that notion has led to new developments in analytical chemistry in order to be able to separate the bioavailable fraction from the non-available fraction. But it has also led to new paradigms in risk assessment, because the risk assessment should no longer be based on what is present in total in the environment, but it should be based on what is available for organisms to be taken up.
A second shift or second development to me was the methodology for risk assessment, which has become much more data intensive. So compared to the early days of environmental toxicology, we now have big databases on toxicity endpoints of chemicals, and we are very much better able to evaluate chemicals on a quantitative basis using all kinds of methods like species sensitivity distributions, adverse outcome pathways, quantitative structure-activity relationships, all that kind of stuff. That all has been great developments in environmental toxicology.
And then a final shift I want to mention is the shift of the analytical chemistry, the detection methods that we use in analytical chemistry. A major development was the availability of liquid chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry, which opened up a whole new area of compound classes that could suddenly be determined. And of course, we found out that that also led to compounds that were actually having effects in the environment that now could be measured as a cause of those effects.
And a third issue I would like to mention is my personal interest in evolution that could be combined with environmental toxicology, because pollutants, being toxic, also exert a strong selective influence, and so we can study evolution through pollution. And all these developments, of course, came together in the further growth of environmental science. A very hot topic, of course, at the moment is the debate about pesticide regulation. So we know about the environmental effects of neonicotinoids, a group of insecticides, very much under discussion. We know about glyphosate, a herbicide, very much under discussion. And what we see actually is that these chemicals and the use of these chemicals in agriculture becomes more and more a topic of concern and of also a wide societal debate. So, for example, in the discussion about glyphosate, there was a citizens' initiative to ban this herbicide. The European Union took note of that, but in the end concluded that there were no reasons enough to ban glyphosate immediately. The fact that about 1 million signatures were put under the statement, the ban on glyphosate, shows that this whole topic is receiving more and more attention and causing more and more concern in a very wide part of society. And so society has developed a really strong aversion against the, let's say, chemically based mass production in agriculture.
One of the most important issues at the moment is the issue of mobile organic chemicals. In the past, we looked at compounds like PCBs and dioxins. Those are chemicals that accumulate in organisms. And you can actually see in industry that new chemicals are being manufactured that don't accumulate so much, because accumulation is one of the criteria that the regulation uses in order to say to industry, no, you cannot make this kind of chemicals anymore. But instead, they're making chemicals that are more mobile. And what does mobility mean? That means that, for instance, these chemicals can more easily pass barriers, like the barriers used in drinking water production, and end up in the drinking water itself. That means that also our legislation has to take into account this type of compound property, the mobility of chemicals. So that's one of the things that we are currently looking into in much more detail than we did in even a couple of years ago. The second topic I consider very important at the moment is the development of computational power in combination with new detection technologies in mass spectrometry. So we're now able to look at what we call the unknown unknowns. Chemicals that we were never aware of the fact that they could be present in our waters can now be identified. But once we have identified them, we actually know very little about them. So there's still a lot of work to do for environmental chemists and environmental toxicologists in order to understand what these new unknowns might mean for our environment.
And of course, there are new chemicals all the time. So we have microplastics, we have nanomaterials, we have emerging chemicals that escape our notice. And so environmental scientists have to really work hard, and we need more people and more young people especially to develop new methods to assess all these, the flood of new environmental chemicals that are coming into society, and then society doesn't want all that, and so there's lots of things to do.